Good morning. Welcome to Friday, April 3rd. You've made it through your first whole week. Aren't you excited? The weekend's coming and your life won't change much. But anyway, today for your objective, it says I will outline and demonstrate my comprehension of the abolitionist movement. You're going to read chapter 15, section 2, but you're only reading the first part. You are going to read through where it talks about the African American abolitionists. Then you're going to stop. The rest of that section 2, you're actually going to do on Monday, and you're going to outline both. But I didn't, it was a long section, so I didn't want you to have to do both on the same day. So today's the first half, Monday's the second half. I'm going to actually put up a template for you. It's already up on video at this point, up on the Etsy account. You may use my template and just use your computer and fill it in, or you can do your own. That is up to you. Outlining is pretty much an individual thing. It's not always the same for everyone. So I'm just going to do one that would work, and you're welcome to use it. Remember, you're finishing the second half of this section on Monday. While you're reading today, I want to talk about the abolitionist movement. Okay, remember these religious revivals and the Second Great Awakening? Well, a lot of these religious people thought it was against God to hold people into slavery. So they wanted to eliminate it. And the abolitionist movement means abolish, get rid of. They wanted to end slavery. What's interesting is most of these abolitionist movements were, of course, up north. A lot of them were in New England, in the Boston area, Philadelphia. And a lot of them were women. A lot of the abolitionists were women because rich white women living in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, they had helpers. They had people that were nannies that watched their kids. They had people who did the dishes, did their laundry. They had servants. So they had a lot of time. If you were a regular working class person, you didn't have time to be part of the abolitionist movement or any movement. Because remember, you know how they were working in factories in these big cities. They worked sun up to sundown, very little pay. They didn't have food. They were all living like 10, 15 people in a small apartment. So they didn't have time to, do a movement. But these other rich white women had a lot of time on their hands, and this was one of the things they chose to use it for. They chose to use it for good. The earliest movements were prior to even us becoming a country. Some of our founders eliminated slavery in the Declaration of Independence, which is interesting because Thomas Jefferson wrote it and basically abolished slavery, but he still had slaves. And he kept the slaves after it was amended and changed and they put slavery back in. He kept all his slaves through his death and only gave a few of their freedom even after he died. So it's kind of interesting. But we know one of the biggest abolitionists at that time was Franklin. He started his own anti-slavery society, back before 1776. So abolitionist ideas have been around since the beginning of our country. But in the 1800s, with all this reform, the Second Great Awakening, they really come into fruition. And there's such a difference between the North and the South. The North, almost everybody, by early 1800s, almost every state had already eliminated slavery. So they wanted the South too. The difference was, up north, they were manufacturing. And they had lots of immigrants that they could use for very low pay and abuse, and they weren't slaves. They didn't have a great life, but they weren't slaves. Where in the South, it was almost all agricultural, and they had a lot of people had very large plantations, and it was their way of life. If they were paying the people to work, they felt like they wouldn't have a business. So there's definitely a big divide between the North and the South. Now, I got to tell you, don't even think in your mind that the Northern workers were like, woohoo, let's abolish slavery, because they weren't. The Northern workers were petrified that if they abolished slavery and all these slaves were allowed to leave the South, they would come up and take their work. And remember, the slaves had never been paid in their lives. So the immigrants, they took low wages, but they were so worried, these low workers, that if the slaves were freed, they would come up and work for even less than they were willing to work for, and they would take their jobs. So I don't want you thinking, woo, everybody wanted, in the North wanted slavery to end. It didn't. It was not like that. It was some, but definitely not most people up north. And, the people who did want to stop slavery were loud. They had movements, they had lectures, they protested, they did a lot of things. So they had a loud voice, but it certainly wasn't the majority of the people living up north. Just want you to understand that. Okay. After we had the Constitutional Convention, it was still brought up we should end slavery. Of course, they didn't. Now we know the Quakers never believed in it. They didn't believe that there should be slavery at all. So Philadelphia was definitely a hotbed for abolitionists because there were a lot of Quakers living there. Now, this interesting is that there were different plans for colonization. A lot of people are like, oh, we should do it gradually, release, here, there, make it a slow process. And then there was this other group, which I think is quite interesting. It's the American Colonization Society. Okay, so their thing was, hey, we should go down to the South and we should buy slaves. And then we're going to send them back to Africa. And the place that it becomes is Liberia, which is still a country in Africa today. So the American Colonization Society would go out and get money donated. And then they would buy a slave. And then they would put them on a boat and send them to Liberia in Africa. Now, this is the problem. They didn't buy the whole family. So it wasn't like it was a man, woman, and their 4 kids all being bought at the same time and sent over as a unit. No, they might buy the mom or a kid or the dad. And then they would send them over there. Now, you got to remember, this is 1800s. Some of these people have been here since the 1600s. They've had 200 years. So they, were like, hey, we're going to send you over there. And the African Americans, these freed slaves, they didn't want to go. They didn't have their families, and they didn't speak any of the language. They didn't know the culture. They'd been here for centuries, some of their families. So, no, they don't want to go over there. And then it wasn't like we went over there and we're like, hey, let's just do this. No, we're Americans. We weren't nice to the people that had owned Liberia originally, of course. We had to take it in any way we could because that's how we are. So anyway, so that didn't go over really well. They tried. I mean, you got to give them credit. They thought about it and they were trying to do the right thing. They just didn't do it in the right way. Okay. By the end, only about 10,000 African Americans were released to Liberia. And Liberia's, because of the beginning, has always had issues with their government. You're welcome to look it up and check it out. You guys have lots of time on your hands now. And you can find out more about Liberia. And then some of my absolute favorite abolitionists were the Grimke sisters. You're going to read about them on page 416. The Grimke sisters, Angelina and Sarah, they were born into a rich white family that owned a plantation with a lot of slaves, and they were appalled by the whole thing. So they end up moving up north, and they join the abolitionists, and when their parents die, for their inheritance, they said, hey, why don't you just give us slaves? So they got the slaves and they released them, which was the right thing to do. And they did write about the experience of owning slaves and what the slave's life was like, which was a really good thing for the abolitionists, because now they have white people from the South saying slavery's wrong. One of the other famous books at this time period was Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Remember the Beecher, Lyman Beecher? They're related, of course. Well, she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it was about how horrible life was for the slaves. and it was fictional. It was totally fictional, but she based it on stories she'd heard, etc. But anyway, that was a really big propaganda piece about anti-slavery. Now, there were a lot of African Americans who, some of them were born free, some bought their own freedom, and others were escaped slaves. And they ran away to Philadelphia, Boston, etc., the northern states. And many of them were abolitionists. They wanted to end slavery. That would make sense. And many of them went out and they did some newspapers, they lectured, they did a lot of things to try to stop slavery. The last person I want to talk about is William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison, he actually started his own newspaper called The Liberator, and he was absolutely abolitionist. And so he was writing about the atrocities of slavery. So that pretty much sums up what's going on in this section. The role of Frederick Douglass is going to start Monday's outline. So only go to African American abolitionist. You do not have to do the role of Frederick Douglass today. Okay, the template is already on Edsby. You're welcome to use it. You don't have to, but you can. If you have any questions, you can send me your Edsby message. Remember, as soon as you finish all your assignments, please take pictures of them, upload them to Edsby. I can check them and get them in the grade book. Have a great weekend. Bye, guys. Congratulations are due because we got through this whole week. Yay! See you on Monday.